We begin the day with the new sheriff and the not-so-Wild West. Now, this is how U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance today described his boss, U.S. President Donald Trump, the new sheriff. He didn't take this cowboy analogy further during his speech at the Munich Security Conference. We were left to assume that Europe and the U.S. represent some version of the Wild West. And yes, there is a war in eastern Ukraine, but it remains a flashpoint in a fragile but still very established rules-based international order. Definitely not the Wild West. While European leaders may worry that Trump's foreign policy will usher in an era of tumbleweed turmoil, the picture Vice President Vance and Ukrainian President Zelenskyy delivered today tells us that these allies are still very much invested in a world void of high noon showdowns.
We had a number of fruitful conversations, a number of things for us to follow up and work on. And fundamentally, the goal is, as President Trump outlined it, we want the war to come to a close. We want the killing to stop, but we want to achieve a durable, lasting peace, not the kind of peace that's going to have Eastern Europe in conflict just a couple years down the road. So we had a number of good conversations about how we might accomplish that together, and certainly we'll have many more in the days, weeks, and months to come. President Zelenskyy.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Very briefly, I think Vice President said everything and absolutely correct. We are very thankful for American support. President Trump, we have good conversation today. Our first meeting, not last, I'm sure, and really what we need to speak more, to work more, and to prepare the plan how to stop Putin and finish the war.
All right, there's two leaders there face to face. Let's go now to Munich. DW's chief international editor, Richard Volker. He's at the Munich Security Conference. Richard, I mean, watching and listening, it seems like it was a cordial meeting. Have these two leaders, have they found common ground?
Yeah, well, Brett, I mean, it's kind of one of the features of the last few weeks, and particularly this week, where there's been so much news coming out of the Trump administration, so many statements, so many positions being expressed by various members of the administration, that almost everything that all of these figures say, whether it's J.D. Vance, the vice president, or Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, who's also been in Europe the last week, kind of gets examined down to the last word, and whether that is something that is, bad sounding for Ukraine or potentially good sounding for Ukraine. And I think the words that Ukraine will be taking some encouragement from in that clip that we just heard from J.D. Vance, and also that Europeans will also quite like, is where he said that the United States wants to have a durable peace, and that, not a situation where there could be a return to war in just a couple of years. And that has been the concern, I think, ever since, Donald Trump has been barreling towards this idea of talks with Vladimir Putin, this idea that he wants the war to finish early, this fear that the Americans just want this war to end, and they're not so interested in exactly how it ends or whether it ends in a way that is sustainable. So those words are being poured over. But whether those really end up being the important words, it's just too early to say. Everything is in flux. And especially when you're dealing with Donald Trump, of course, he's an unpredictable leader. So I think everyone you talk to here is really saying you've got to stand back from all the statements and just look at, okay, where is this heading in sort of structural terms, and not rush to judgment on the basis of everything that any member of the administration says.
We know in the past, though, that J.D. Vance, he's been open with his criticism of so much U.S. military aid going to Ukraine. Has he softened his stance somewhat?
I think that there's no real sense that he's softened his stance. But, remember, J.D. Vance is not speaking independently. He is representing Donald Trump here, and this is something you definitely get from all of the members of the Trump administration. They're always very quick to refer to Donald Trump, as the man behind everything. But J.D. Vance, when he was here a year ago, when he was still a U.S. senator, was talking about, from his point of view, that the United States simply could not justify the amount of funding that was going to Ukraine, and that its defense industrial complex could not sustain the volume of munitions and other weapons that were going to Ukraine, and that simply on the basis of that had to reduce. The position now stated by the US administration is that it's up to the Europeans to take over the lion's share of providing weapons and financial support to the Ukrainians, which of course they've been doing on a large scale too, but roughly 50-50 between the Europeans and the US. The US indicating that it wants to provide very much less going forward.
And we know an acceptable end to this war, very different meaning for Kyiv than it is for the Trump administration at the moment. But what about post-war Ukraine? Are we talking about two different visions of the future of this country?
I think we're talking about way more than two potential different visions. We're talking about a whole range of circumstances and the whole situation is so unpredictable. Really, people do not know what the outcome is likely to be. I think the prevailing worry that is still there among the Ukrainians and more broadly among the Europeans is what we were just referring to, that the Trump administration ultimately just wants this war to end so it can get back to other business. And that it's not really too bothered about the outcome. And I think critically, it's not concerned about justice. It's not concerned about having a sort of a fair outcome. The Ukrainians want the Russians to pay for this invasion. The Ukrainians want to see Vladimir Putin held responsible. They want to see an outcome which puts Ukraine in a stronger position for the future, not a weaker position for the future. All of these things, you get the strong sense, these are not really priorities for the United States. The United States administration takes it would say a kind of a realist view of the situation, that Russia is ultimately stronger, Ukraine is ultimately weaker, and that will ultimately decide the fate of the situation, and that the Ukrainians, essentially as the weaker party, cannot be picky about the outcome. And I think that is the profound worry that the Ukrainians still have, despite any slightly nicer words that we may have seen coming out of that meeting with J.D. Vance.
Yeah, a profoundly different American view today compared to 3 years ago on the eve of this war. Our chief international editor, Richard Walker, in Munich. Richard, as always, thank you. Well, joining me now from the Munich Security Conference is Kurt Volker. He's a former U.S. ambassador to NATO. He was the U.S. Special Representative to Ukraine during the first Trump administration. Ambassador, it's good to have you back on the program. Good to see you. I'll ask you what many here in Europe, many, I'm sure, in Munich, where you are asking after learning of Trump's peace plans for Ukraine. Has the United States betrayed its ally, Ukraine?
Oh, no, I don't think so at all. I think this is very much in line with what President Trump and President Zelenskyy discussed throughout the autumn. You'll remember they met in September. They had a few phone calls. They met again at Notre Dame in Paris. And President Trump made clear he wants to end the war as quickly as possible, that he needs to call President Vladimir Putin, which he has now done. He called Zelenskyy right afterwards to give him a readout. He is indeed pushing for an end to the war as quickly as possible. And as he said, and as J.D. Vance said earlier today, that all the options are on the table.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says that the U.S. does not have a ready-made plan for settling the war yet, despite all the talk from various members of this Trump administration this week. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think that's exactly right, that they are here to have some initial conversations to try to get the Russians to agree to begin some discussions, consult with our European allies about what they are prepared to do, and bring all that back to President Trump so he can make some decisions about where he wants to go. It was media that was reporting that there was a plan, but this President's Special Envoy Keith Kellogg, as well as the President himself, had made clear there's not a plan per se. It is an effort to get the negotiations started.
Do we know what President Trump has, on the table that he could use to force Russia's hand here?
Yeah, I think there are three big things that have already been talked about and that I think are important. The first is increasing U.S. oil and gas production and working with others to try to drive down global energy prices. That will have an impact on Putin's budget. Second is sanctions, and he has threatened to increase sanctions on Russia, and J.D. Vance just did this the other day as well. Those would be on Russia's energy sector and on Russia's financial sector. They could have a bigger impact if really strict sanctions were enforced. And third is putting in place some kind of deterrent force in Ukraine to deter Russia from future attacks and to continue to provide military support to Ukraine so it has access to the weapons that it needs to defend itself. I think all of those things are signals to Vladimir Putin that he's never going to defeat Ukraine completely. He's never going to win this war. So he needs to actually stop the fighting. Thus far, Putin has not agreed to do that. But I think we're just in the very beginning stages of seeing a combination of sticks and carrots being offered to Vladimir Putin.
When you and I last spoke, it was back in 2021, you said that Vladimir Putin intended to block Ukraine from ever joining the European Union and NATO. President Trump sent his new defense secretary to Europe this week with the message that there will be no NATO membership for Ukraine anytime soon. So isn't Trump in a way aiding and abetting the Kremlin?
Well, first off, you're absolutely right. That's Putin's objective. He wants to keep Ukraine out of NATO, out of the EU. He doesn't actually want Ukraine to be a sovereign and independent country. He wants to be part of a Russian empire. But as far as what Secretary had be not realistic as a result of these negotiations, that I think is quite correct. Russia's never going to agree to NATO membership for Ukraine, and so you shouldn't expect it to be a result of these negotiations. Moreover, you shouldn't even be talking about it with Russia. It's none of their business. It is a matter for Ukraine and NATO to decide on their own.
We have heard repeatedly from U.S. officials this week that Europe needs to step up for its own defense. Today, we appeared to get an idea of who the U.S. may now see as the emerging powerhouse of European defense. I want you to take a listen to this.
I do want to emphasize that it's quite intentional that our first European bilateral is right here in Poland. The symbolism is not lost. In fact, it is intentional. We see Poland as the model ally on the continent, willing to invest not just in their defense, but in our shared defense and the defense of the continent. Our relationship is strong and growing stronger every day. Poland, a strategic frontline partner on NATO's eastern flank. Poland, a staunch U.S. ally.
Ambassador, is he picking up on something that you've been advising now for several years? I think 4 years ago, you said that Poland and Ukraine should maybe carry out joint military exercises to show real commitment to Ukraine's security. Are they maybe following the advice that you would have given?
Well, I don't think it has gotten to that point yet of joint exercises. But what Hedgeseth is referring to is Poland's decision to bring its defense spending up to 5% of GDP. It's currently at about 4.7. And Poland has contributed substantially to all of our shared effort in supporting Ukraine. Most of the military equipment that goes to Ukraine goes through Poland. It's where we have maintenance and repair facilities. It's where we have U.S. Armed Forces personnel who are not in Ukraine, but they are in Poland. Poland has shouldered a lot of refugees coming in from Ukraine as well. So it has really stepped up to the plate. And that's what I think Hedgeseth is referring to. He would like to see all of our allies step up as much as Poland has.
Ukraine's President Zelenskyy, he says that he thinks that Vladimir Putin could be preparing for war against NATO countries as early as next year. What's your read on that?
Yeah, I think that Putin is definitely preparing his military to grow substantially, and his target in doing that is not only Ukraine, it's NATO. So former parts of the Russian Empire that he wants to conquer. So he is doing that. I think his ability to do that is questionable, both economically, militarily, industrially. Can he really do that? And moreover, he can't do it in a year. I think the Estonian intelligence assessment that just came out put it at 5 years. Denmark had a similar range of 5 years is what they expected for Russia to be able to constitute that kind of ability to threaten NATO. But it's clear that that is what his intentions are.
Mr. Volker, it's always good to talking with you. We appreciate you taking the time out of what is, I'm sure, a busy schedule for you there at the Munich Security Conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
And joining me now from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, is Kira Rudik. She's the member of the Ukrainian parliament, and she's leader of the opposition Voice Party. Kira, it is good to have you back on the program. We've talked many times in the past 3-4 years. I want to ask you that what we have seen and experienced in the past week coming from the Trump White House. Has the U.S. betrayed your country?
Hello, Brent, and thank you so much for having me. Well, we have heard many statements from the different United States officials. What we didn't see is actual proposal at the table. And I think we should keep our understanding of what's going on up until we will see this proposal at the table. Because the rhetoric from the United States has gone from Ukraine will never join in NATO to the statements by Vice President J.D. Vance when he did not exclude the possibility of having U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine if Putin would not negotiate. Mm-hmm. So we need to wait for the baseline for any kind of the ceasefire deal. And this baseline is, what are the security guarantees? What is the reason why we think Putin will keep his part of the bargain? Until we see that, I think we should be only talking about any prospects, but not giving our understanding of everything, like literally everything that we hear.
So Kira, you're not willing to begin coming to terms yet with the fact that Ukraine's future may not include NATO membership. That's something that you're not willing to have on the table.
Well, again, NATO membership is just one of the ways of ensuring our security guarantees and ensuring that Russia would not attack us again. And if they do, then we will be protected. So if there are any potential good alternatives to that, well, let's discuss them. But as of right now, Ukraine's aim to join NATO is in Ukraine's constitution. Mm-hmm. Ukraine's people are supporting Ukraine joining NATO. And I think we have all the rights to be considered as NATO members, and that should be on the table and should be discussed.
What about a peace deal that would allow Russia to keep Crimea, allow Russia to keep the Donbass? You would have a diminished Ukraine geographically. Is that something that you would accept?
Well, again, Brent, let's start with the most important part, which is, again, the future of our country, the security of our people. We right now don't even have this on the table, and everybody's already talking about Ukraine forfeiting some land and agreeing to have less territories, etc.
I'm asking you this, though, because we have heard this from the U.S. president and from the U.S. defense secretary this week, saying, we're not going to return to those pre-2014 borders. I mean, they've said that this week.
Well, they've said that they don't think that this is a realistic objective. But I want to remind you and keep this in mind, that just 3 years ago, all our allies were telling that we will fall down in 2 or 3 days. Yeah. So we respect this opinion. But we are a sovereign nation and sovereign state, and we have our own goals. And these goals could include regaining of our territorial integrity. Because we didn't do anything wrong. We were a sovereign state. Russia has brutally attacked us, occupied our territories, and we do not see a reason why we should at least formally give up on that.
Almost 3 years ago, Kira, you and I spoke. It was shortly after Russia began its full-scale invasion. And I remember we spoke of your father and what you tell him that you are fighting for, and about him being very proud of you. Do you still have this conversation today?
Yes, of course. And my dad is still proud of me. Actually, it's his birthday today. So,
happy birthday.
Brent, for us, we did not change our objective and our goal for Ukraine to have future, for Ukraine to have European future, and for the next generations not to have to fight the same war again over and over and over. And of course, that will definitely happen if the potential deal that would be made would not be strong enough and will not guard Russia away from our borders, our territories, and our people. And this is why we need to be strong right now, more than ever, when we are negotiating and we are standing for what we believe at and for what we have paid an ultimate price by our people, by our children, and by everything that we are possessing right now.
Well, despite the situation, I want to wish your father a happy birthday and say to you, Kira, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us, and we wish you and everyone in Ukraine all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent.